Good afternoon friends. Let us take up another component of rural sociology with regard to continuity and change. And here in the unit 4th we have changing agrarian structure and rural development concern in India in rural society. And within that framework another good component which has to be dealt is farmer suicide in India. This is basically chapter 18th of the whole component, and chapter 18th which is devoted to farmer suicide in rural India. I think farmer suicide definitely is going to be a grey issue, especially when we try to speak about the Indian society, and I think nowhere we try to accept that suicide is going to be seen as something which is going to be quite familiar phenomenon. And I think we try to see that across India we try to see certain shades of farmer suicide, and definitely it raises certain important issues. So, basically this chapter is going to highlight the changing it will try to discuss upon or highlight the issues related to farmer suicide, its trends and the possible solutions. Friends, I think as we have talked about the issue of rural development in general, we have talked about how we try to see the issue of green revolution, and also we try to speak about the various movements which are associated with the rural society, which we try to see in terms of the agrarian movement and the rural movements which have been there. We have talked about Tibhaga movement, we have talked about the Telangana movement, we have also talked about the Naxalite movement which has been there, which are part and parcel of the Indian society across the different states. And of recent we have also talked about the issue of new farmers movement. So, that way I think the rural society is full of what you can say full of changes in terms of the dynamism, and this dynamism is visible basically through the understanding of these unrest which has been there, and these agrarian unrest basically speaks about both the positive and the negative. Positive definitely can be seen in terms of how we can evaluate the process of change, whereby the society by themselves are trying to bring about the changes in their existing structure. And also we try to see that these changes are to be made visible through the various movements or revolt that has been there. Either we try to speak about the historical connotation, the fight against the state, whether it may be the British state, or sometimes we try to see the state in the form of government, or we try to see the policies which have been implemented by the state. So, in all practical senses we try to see that the movements have been seen as the growing concern, and I think parallelly we also try to see that the new initiatives in the form of agrarian policies which have been generated by the government, sometimes it has also led to some hue and crisis. I think all of us may be familiar with the new bills which have been introduced with regard to the change in the what you can say agriculture scenario, the agricultural bill which has been introduced, and how it is going to create the hue and crisis with regard to the various farmers across the states. And that way we try to see that the sort of peasant and the farmers, they are not going to be the masses, they are not going to be the people who are basically trying to be just docile, they also have the revolutionary character, and that way I think we try to see that they are visible in the form of certain resistance which they try to show in the form of various movements. But I think this is the one can say the brighter side, which basically speaks about that how farmers are to be seen as an active agents, and how they are going to bring about the transformation by themselves through certain initiatives trying to resist the state, the policies, and many other issues. But on the contrary, if you try to see, basically we also try to find out that there are certain important concerns which are happening in the rural society, and because of that I think the negative consequences are also visible, especially among the peasant, the farmers. And we basically try to see that we had many time cases which are coming up, although the frequency may be low, but sometimes we try to see that the cases of farmer suicide definitely are going to be visible in various newspapers. And also we try to see that the farmer suicides are basically seen as the negative consequences of the development. And as we know that the issue of farmer suicide is basically seen as an issue which is of concern to the policymakers, to the politicians for that sake, or maybe trying to speak about the general masses in India. But important is that what make them to commit suicide, and definitely suicide always have a negative connotation for any society, because when we try to speak about the suicide, definitely it is seen as the person who is been away from the world, and sometimes we have the different explanations which we are going to deal with, that what make the person to commit suicide, and how or what are the consequences of that. But before that, what are the various policies or what are the different concerns which leads to the suicides. So, I think these are certain issues which will be highlighted in this chapter, and the discussion basically will try to involve into the various issues which has led to the farmer suicide. I think to begin with, we can just say that soon after independence, the scarcity of grains was projected in India as the reason for hunger and famine, and the basis upon which the massive development projects led by science and technology such as the green revolution were justified. So, virtually on the one hand we have how the sort of dependency has been generated with regard to the agriculture, that was one stage, and then second thing was that how they are to be seen as the producer sites, the rural India has been seen as the producer site. And thirdly, we try to see that in order to supplement the nation, they are to be seen as the producers for the nation, and that way sometimes we have various issues which are related to the food sovereignty, the food security for that sake, or sometimes we try to speak about the issues related to certain amount of dignity. So, I think somewhere we try to see that these sort of mixes are there which are basically been visible in the rural India. And green revolution was seen basically as an answer to bring about the increase in the productivity, as we have shared earlier also that green revolution was basically seen as an outcome of the various programs which have been initiated in India, like the high yield variety seed was the program which has came into prominence in 1970s, and then we also try to see that the new technology which has been introduced in the rural India. So, there was a gradual shift whereby the society has moved from the so called subsistence economy to the capitalistic economy, and that way I think we try to see that certain amount of structural changes have been brought about in the rural society, and in that format we try to see that these changes definitely were visible in various forms. And I think green revolution definitely has led to the enhancement of the what you can say crops, the grain productivity has increased, but on the contrary it also has created certain nuances in the rural society. So, that way we try to see that there are certain ups and downs which are revolving in and around the developmental issues which has been either injected into the rural society, or sometimes they have been taken up by the rural society, but it has the severe consequences also. The green revolution which was been introduced in Asia in general in the 1960s was entirely driven by the pursuit of higher productivity. I think somewhere we can say that it was having a certain amount of capitalistic tone, that way making the rural in line with the industrial, whereby the capitalistic sort of capitalistic mode has to be invented, where the production has to be made in such a fashion that it is going to meet the demand of the masses, and that way I think the pursuit for higher productivity was seen as one thing which has basically make the society to move. After half of century of the implementation of the green revolution, the new forms of scarcity has been projected, and the cause of the newer forms of the rural vulnerability was seen in the form of what we are going to discuss, that is the issue of suicide. And consequently, the dominant developmental response these days to the farmer suicide is to make agricultural economics remunerative, or it is to be seen in terms of the payment through a variety of techno institutional changes. So, techno institutional changes are basically seen as the way or the via media through which we can enhance the economic remunerative prices, especially with regard to agriculture, and that is how we try to see the changes are to be brought about in the rural society. For the past couples of years, farmer suicide has become an issue in the academic narratives, especially the policy analysis and in the everyday discourse. The issue came at the time when the debate of the agrarian economy was shifting from the debate of mode of production of the 1960s to the growing crisis of the economy in the 1980s, and of recent the farmer suicide in the recent years. I think the study by Daniel Thorner in 1982 or Kathleen Gauck for that sake in 1980s, they are basically trying to discuss about these issues. However, the beginning of the agrarian crisis requires to be located much earlier to the beginning of suicide, which goes back to the 1980s when the terms of trades were dominating the state policies. I think this is where we try to see that the footing of the suicide was located in the 1980s when the term of trade were going against the agriculture. And I think this is basically where we try to see that agrarian crisis is basically seen as an outcome of the changes which have taken place in terms of trade and which were going against the agriculture. Basically, people like Balagopal or Ashok Rudra, they were basically trying to speak about these particular issue. Similarly, Lipton's work on has indicated on the urban biased policies. So, I think these are certain issues which we try to see were dominating the state policies, and farming was becoming a loose proportion. I think this is where we try to see the drift has taken place, that on the one side we have the issue of agrarian crisis which is emerging because of the changes which have been introduced in the state, and with regard to that we try to see that the trade which was basically meant for market production has led to certain amount of urban bias policies, and these urban bias policies has basically led to certain change in the equations with regard to the farming practices. Nonetheless, the crisis of agrarian economy during the decade of 1980s was expressed in the different forms. It was largely led by the farmers movement in the different parts of India, as I said earlier, because the farmers movement definitely was seen as trying to resist or also trying to oppose various policies which has been put by the state. Nowhere their protests were translated into the form of suicide, because the organizational form of farmer struggle or the movement provided them a sense of identity and belongingness. However, a shift in the discourse came during the time when the Indian state was succumbing to the pressure of the global capital. So, virtually we try to see that the initial what you can say, as I said, that the farmers movement which has been there was seen as the positive stories. Basically, they were seen as their own identity, the fight for their dignity in that sense, and the sense of identity. All these things were coming together and they were trying to stand in totality. But when we try to speak about the Indian state being succumbed to the pressure of the global capital in the form of new economic policy, that was seen as a turning point, and that has been pointed out by Asadi in 2004, that no farmers movement advocated a suicide as a form of tactics to oppose or confront the global capital. In fact, during the current debates, the farmers movement was also losing its tempo in the rise of the new economic policies. Thus, in the midst of the failure of the declining tempo of the farmers movement, one can locate the suicide becoming a fact. So, virtually we can say that somewhere the pace of farmers movement, the sort of pressure which has been generated by the farmers movement, when it has shown a shift in terms of a decline, there we try to see that the issue of suicide has become come into prominence. So, I think we try to see that the decline of farmers movement has led to the rise of the farmers suicide. This is how we try to relate, and that has been pointed out by Asdi also in 2004. Interestingly, during the decade of globalization, no activist from Indian side committed the suicide protesting against the globalization. I think this is where we try to see the strength of Indian society because of various institutional forces. We try to see that the suicide was minimized. However, Lee Kwing-hae, a South Korean farmer and a lawmaker in Cancun, who was holding a banner that read WTO kills farmer, and committed the first suicide against the globalization. Now, this is basically where we try to see a symbolic shift which has taken place, that Lee Kwing-hae, who had committed suicide under the banner of WTO kill farmers, and that is how we try to see that effect of globalization was been visible in the form of symbolization which has been projected through this particular instance. Lee was the former president of the Korean National Futures Farmers and the Fishermen's Association, and he was basically trying to oppose the globalization in terms of the issue that it is going to impede, or it is going to bring about the drastic structural changes in the rural society. And thus one can see that farmer suicide was the result of the deep or the sharpening agrarian crisis emanating from the capitalistic development in agriculture. Although there are 5 important debates which attempts to look at the issue of suicide differently, but still we try to find out that the farmer suicide was basically seen as an outcome of the agrarian crisis which has come up because of the issue of capitalistic development in the agriculture. But before going into the detail about the issue of farmer suicide, I think the issue that becomes prime is the phenomenon of suicide and how it has to be seen. Basically, we try to see that suicide has been studied sociologically. So, being a student of sociology, let us understand how we can have the understanding of the suicide sociologically. So, basically translated into the rates, the suicide could be understood not just as an individual action with meaning located in the particular context, but it is collectively seen as a much wider index of the social decay or the progress. The problem of definition also arises, and suicide is a tricky concept to pin down. An existential riddle stunning in its opaqueness, as Brown has put it. How, for example, do we classify what have been called as the partial suicide? So, I think somewhere we try to see it is difficult to really conceptualize suicide or categorize suicide in as a specific sociological phenomenon, but to some extent we can say that it can be understood sociologically. That is going to be important, and the credit goes to Emile Durkheim, who had penned down in his classical sociological study Lee's suicide in 1897. It is seen as the best known book about the topic in the social sciences, and probably beyond the ethnographic analysis of what lies behind people attempt to take their own lives remain relatively a few in number. For Durkheim, suicide was an objective social fact irreducible to individual psychology or biology with a different social formation, creating propensity towards what he identified as the 4 different types of suicide. In highly regulated society, suicides were likely to be altruistic because he tried to see the 4 conditions which basically motivates the person to go for suicide. Altruistic, which was been seen as a phenomenon, altruistic suicide which was been seen with regard to highly regulated society, with the individual needs subordinated to those of the wider suicide, that is the fatalistic. So, I think we have a range of suicide which has been talked about by Emile Durkheim. where when the regulations were so oppressive as to allow no alternative possible actions, that is another way in which the suicide can be treated. So, basically we try to see that Durkheim saw as an under regulated conditions the post industrial society where we have the anomic or the egoistic suicide. So, virtually we try to see that suicide was basically seen in the different format depending upon the conditionality. Egoistic suicides occur when the individual becomes detached from his or her society, and the anomic suicide take place in the context where there is lack of fit between the individual leading to his society as a member, where the aspirations for example are out of the step with the possibility of achieving those aspirations. We try to find that it may lead to the anomic suicide. So, the suicide rates, as Durkheim showed through his use of statistics, were generally fairly constant for the countries in which they were recorded, with the major rise or decrease in the suicide rates indexing the wider social changes. Within each society, Durkheim also noted some common variation. Those who were not married were more likely likely than the married to commit suicide. For example, as were those without the children, they were also having the frequency of suicides more. And although the soldiers were likely than civilians to take their own lives, suicide rates in general were higher during the peacetime than in the war situation. So, I think these are certain conditionalities which have been talked about by Durkheim, and basically we try to see that Durkheimian insights remain useful, and precisely because they are so broad that they can also speak about the differences between the different incidents of suicides. Durkheim also assumed that cultures were homogeneous entities, and he made a distinction in suicide rate across the class boundaries, for example, between men and women within a given milieu. So, that way if we try to see, I think Durkheim has clearly tried to speak about the issue of suicide. One possibility in terms of the altruistic suicide, whereby we try to see that when the members are closer to the society, societal norms, and under pressure they are committing suicide. We have the egoistic suicide, where we try to see that the members are away from the societal norms, and that they create suicide. And then we have the anomic suicide, when we try to see that there is lesser regulation by the state, the policies that also create the so called anomic suicide. And then also we have the fatalistic suicide, and the fatalistic suicide is basically seen as a condition whereby we have the high deregulations in the society. So, we try to see all the contrast. We have the higher integration and the lesser integration, both the extremes will lead to the suicide. Higher regulation and the lesser regulations, they can also create a suicide. So, virtually we try to see that the suicides are basically seen as a biological or the physical entity, but if you try to see or if you try to locate that in a specific societal framework, we try to see that it is based on the societal outcome. And that way I think when we try to see the farmer suicide, we basically try to see that the farmer suicide are to be seen basically in relation to the societal context. Either it is the question of the state, many times we may relate certain suicides, farmer suicide, we can categorize it into the case of egoistic suicide, when the members are being detached from the mainstream society. That also is one possibility. Sometimes we can say that it may be seen as an anomic suicide, where we try to see the conditions which are going to be devastated, and we try to see that lesser controls are there that also can create certain amount of suicide into the category of what you can say anomic suicide. And finally, we can have the fatalistic one, where we try to see that over regulations which have been generated by the state can also lead to certain amount of suicide. So, in India, where suicide remains illegal and taboo, with the incidents recorded by the National Crime Record Bureau under the reporting, which might be visible in the form of higher rates of suicide. An interesting twist in the Indian context is that while the suicides may go underreported among the general population for the fear of reprisals, the farmer suicide in response to which they have been widely publicized. Basically with regard to the state government compensation that sometimes is visible. So, we might well have to be might well see that it has been over reported because of drawing the attention of the government towards that particular issue. So, sometimes we may say that since suicide is something which has to be seen across the section, across the society, and sometimes we have the distorting figures, the statistical picture which has been projected sometimes may not give us the ground realities in the real sense. That is why this issue becomes a bit trickish. But while agrarian suicide is certainly an issue, the farmers are not only the population committing the suicides, but if we try to estimate in this collection, we are trying to find out that we see farmer suicide as a problem for the public policy, and delineating the problem in this way makes it straightforward for the government agencies to manage this issue of farmer suicide. Daniel Monster, he was basically speaking about focusing upon the agrarian suicide and recognizes well the political choices at work in framing the issue of farmer suicide as a distinctive type of self-killing. And drawing on the fieldwork in the Wayanad district of Kerala, he argues that much of the problem is not the focus on farmer suicide per se, but the lack of reflection in much of the literature on what the implications of defining farmer suicide as a particular kind of problem might be, and also the lack of the ethnographic specificities in the discussion on the issue can also not make us clear about the whole issue. So, virtually we try to see that sociologically speaking, there are the different ways of looking to this particular phenomenon. Sometimes they have to be seen with regard to the individualistic value, sometimes they are to be related with the so called state policies, and also we have to see that they can be seen with regard to the third party trying to come up into the picture and trying to highlight that particular issue as a pressure group. So, that way I think the locus of the farmer suicide has to be seen across, and it may vary from context to context, and that is why sometimes we do not have a standardized understanding of about the farmer suicide in terms of theorization or in terms of the specific values. Now, further if we try to move on the issues of the debates on suicide, first we have to see that the debate tries to locate the suicide as a part of multiple crises. I think that of course is the starting point. The crises which are ecological, economic and social, and also they are each are interlinked with each other. The ecological crisis is the result of the hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers and the pesticides causing the erosion of the soil fertility, and increasing crops are susceptible to the pest and the disease. So, the heavy indebtedness led to the economic crisis. In the final analysis, we can see that the debate attempts to understand the suicide through the anthropological tool, as has been pointed out by A.R. Vasavi in 1999. Another attempt is to locate the crisis of suicide to the negative growth of agrarian economy. It has to be seen in the recent past as argued by Vandana Shiva, and she comes closer to the Marxist critique, particularly the argument of Patnaik, wherein the latter locates the reason in the liberalization, new colonialism and the imperialist globalization. So, we can see that the suicide are being linked with the issue of liberalization, new colonialism and the imperial globalization. The argument raised by Vandana Shiva is also to understand the larger linkage emanating from the globalization which has created a crisis for agriculture and produced a negative economy in the countryside, and that of course is seen as an important issue which has generated the number of suicide in the rural society. In relation to the argument, we try to see another important debate which can be located with regard to the reason for the suicide, as has been spoken and called as the McKinsey model of development, that creates a space for the industry driven agriculture which ultimately translated into the agribusiness. So, I think somewhere we try to see that this sort of development is basically including the information technology sometimes creates a very different picture in the rural side, countryside, and this model of development has not only accelerated the crisis leading to the environmental catastrophe, but also has destroyed the millions of rural livelihood. So, virtually we try to see that industry driven agriculture along with the industrial information technology sometimes is going to bring about the new sort of crisis which may be visible in the form of farmer suicide. And another way in which we can raise this particular issue is the suicide exclusively been seen as a phenomenon, that is the increasing indebtedness. So, if the higher rate of indebtedness which is seen as an economic phenomenon or the debt trap, so that basically lead to the person to go for suicide. So, we try to see that another important discourse which can be located with regard to the suicide may be seen as the wrong policies which are been pursued by the central or the state government over the past few decades, and even they are going to be creating certain amount of disharmony with regard to substantial investment in the agriculture, and that sometimes lead the person to commit the suicide. And finally, we can see that there are also an attempts to locate the reason in the form of multiple issues such as the we can see the flood situations, manipulations of the prices by the traders, suppliers of the spurious pesticides and the seeds, the decline in the prices of agricultural produce and increase in the cost of agricultural inputs, followed by successive droughts across the year in certain places, and also the neglect of farmers by the previous state governments. So, I think we try to see that there are multiple factors other than the immediate causes which can also lead to the suicide. So, we can say that sometimes the factors may not be the direct factors which are contributing towards the suicide, sometimes the indirect forces or the indirect factors are also leading for the commitment of suicide among the farmers, but important is that the farmer suicides are to be related with various issues. It may be related to the government policies, it may be related to the globalization, it may be related to the failure of the state policies, it may be due to the innovations with regard to the advent of capitalism in the agriculture in the form of agribusiness, or also we can see that it can be seen as a hype which is coming from the media in order to bring about the higher level of compensation to the farmers. So, we can see that there are various factors which may contribute towards the understanding of farmer suicides differently, and in the Indian context, especially if you try to speak about as we are discussing the agrarian capitalism which was been introduced into the social structure, existing social structure was seen as an important reasons. Basically, we try to see that it allowed the different social structure to coexist along with the capitalistic mode, which has allowed the presence of different social structure along the agrarian capitalism, and this did not mean that the state intervention was limited. Its intervention was conditioned by factors which are leading to the increasing productivity, interlinking of the local with the international markets, bringing in the large amount of land under the capitalistic development, removing the social categories who are on the drag on the economy, and finally creating the new social categories such as the rich peasantry who can partake in the capitalistic development. So, we can see that there are different forces which are working in and out the countryside which are basically creating certain amount of changes in the agrarian social structure, and that basically has led to the advent of the farmer suicide. One can say that the method which has been introduced by the green revolution which created the surplus food, no doubt in that, but it has also allowed the global capitalist to enter into the domain of agriculture through the means of seeds, the fertilizers, pesticides for that sake, and it was done through the means of land reforms also. So, we try to see that somewhere the partial successfulness or partial failures which have been seen across various states, like for example, the landforms in Karnataka has been very successful, but also we try to see that we find out that the intervention of market in the form of modern forces that has also created or devastated the issue of farmer suicides in Karnataka. So, virtually we try to see both the contrasts are visible, the successful cases within that state or region, and also we try to see the adverse in the form of farmer suicide, and that is where we try to see the complexity emerges with regard to the farmer suicide. And we basically try to see that the failure of the Indian states in many times may have resulted into the whole issue. And along with that, I think the most important thing that we have to really learn in terms of the growing cases of the farmer suicide is the growing crisis, because the growing crisis in the agriculture basically or in the countryside is basically paving the way for the suicide. So, basically we try to see that the growing crisis is not the result of the path of capitalistic development that the Indian state pursued over the past couple of years, but also due to the global capitalism pursuing the same path. So, virtually we try to see that global capitalism was been brought or introduced as a new methodology to link the autonomous farmers or the social categories with the larger market. So, I think the shift which we were talking about in terms of move from the subsistence economy to the capitalistic economy was seen as one important force which has led to the transformation in the agrarian social structure. The path of development has increased the disparity between the urban and the rural areas. It is true that the poverty percentage over the past 2 decades had declined considerably between the urban and the rural areas, while the disparity has increased or widened. We also try to see that these changes has the influence upon the whole phenomenon. NSSO has counted that between 1977-78 to 1999-2000, the percentage of people living below the poverty line has declined from 51.3% to 26.1%, while in absolute number it has declined from 328.9 million to 260.3 millions. So, that is what we try to see, that we have the betterment in terms of the economic progress which was been visible. The statistics clearly speak about the fact that there is the high yield in terms of the productivity. Even the people who are below the poverty line has also drastically improved upon, and we try to see that the conditions of the rural society has tremendously increased. But it does not mean that you have the better prosperity, you have the lesser suicide. So, on the one hand we try to see that prosperity has been coming, on the other hand we also try to see the number of cases of suicide is also visible. So, we try to see that it has not only made the farmers a debt free categories, rather it has trapped the farmers in the vicious circle of the debt trap. So, the debt nets which has been there, and the farmers which are been part of that because of gaining more and more, that sometimes has made the things more difficult. So, there is no farmer who is not indebted to the financial institutions, the cooperatives, and that way I think they are directly linked with the market with the various other institutions of which they have never been part in the previous situations. So, the failure of the cooperative institutions has further made the large number of farmers to fall back on the money lenders who charge the exorbitant interest. So, this charges varies from a percentage, high percentage from 30 to 60%, and sometimes it is going to be more devastating. And interestingly, the two kinds of money lenders have emerged in the areas where the farmers have committed suicide. One type of money lenders come from within the rural side, while the who are either the big farmers or the capitalistic farmers, and the second type of are the money lenders who are coming from the urban areas. So, we try to see that the new form of categories have emerged with regard to the money lending from within and from outside, and that is where we try to see that it has acted as the new form of a business whereby the rural banking, the sort of cooperatives have failed, and we try to see that these categories were introduced maybe by pressure or it is by compulsion, that we try to see that the farmers were motivated towards moving towards these money lenders which were privately oriented. And we try to see that the money lenders use the different techniques to extract the interest. Unlike the earlier decades, the money lenders in the globalization are seen as trying to appropriate the land in the event of farmers fail to pay the rent, and this is because of uncertainty involved in the agrarian economy. Also, we try to see, as Asdi has pointed out, that agrarian economy requires the physical presence of the physical labor of the money lenders, and which the latter always sought to avoid. And this is the reason why the money lenders demand the interest rather than attaching the property, because somewhere it is seen as a vicious circle. The higher demand for the interest may put them into trap, and once they are into that trap, so they cannot come out. So, we try to see what Asdi is trying to point out, that this is seen as a vicious circle whereby the farmers, the peasantry are basically, or the farmers are moving towards these debt traps in the hands of the private money lenders, and once they are into that trap, so they are continuing with that. And we also try to see that the cost of production which has increased through time, we are trying to see it in terms of the high prices of agricultural produce. The increase in the cost of input prices are seen as the reason, and with that what has happened, of course, is that there is a withdrawal of subsidy, whether it is given for the power or for the fertilizers. So, this has led to the high input prices with regard to the farmers, and this is nothing but the reinforcement of the argument that the term of trade has gone once again against the agriculture, and this has created a situation of negative growth in the agricultural sector. So, virtually we try to find out that the conditionality which has been created in the rural society, especially the withdrawal of subsidy, the withdrawal of the government support in the form of the formal structures, sometimes has created or put the farmers into the pathetic situations. We also try to see that people who are below the poverty lines, they does not have what you can say multiple job opportunities other than the agrarian sectors, and we try to see that large number of rural populations who are moving towards the urban sectors, or because of the increasing pressure on the land is also making a shift towards the new centers. And we try to find out that the fragmentation of land is there, whereby making the lands lesser viable for the production, and this is another important reason whereby the effective contribution by the family members in terms of collectivity, and also the composite use of land in totality has been broken away, and that basically has reduced the productivity, and in the name of production, if they are going for the intensive agriculture, so their results are not going to be that ripe. And we also try to see that there are certain other forces other than the issue of subsidy. Basically, we try to see that the issue related to how the farmers are trying to pose up in terms of forcing the farmers to pay the accumulated debt is going to be something which is going to be recycled, and that has been created again and again. In fact, the United States has increased the subsidy to agriculture, which has been from $73.5 million to $180 billion during the period when the global capitalism began to dominate the world, and these subsidies has benefited only the multinational corporations than the Indian farmers. And we try to see the multinational corporations had adopted a technique to control the third world by including the Indian agriculture, and one such method is to create a monoculture through the new technology such as the seed technology which they wanted to introduce, or the patent regime. Especially Monsanto, for example, introduced the BT cotton in 2002, and that of course was basically seen as an important shift, basically in the process of which the Indian farmer lost 1 billion rupee due to the crop failure, and this is not compensated with nor provided with any alternative to the loss. So, virtually we try to see that the new changes which have been introduced by the multinational corporations with the introduction of the new seeds or sometimes the hybrid seeds, and when the failure of these crops have taken place as an experiment, sometimes they were into a drastic and economic crisis, and that conditions has basically made them more vulnerable to these particular issues. So, we try to see that these sort of conditionalities has basically led to a certain amount of changes. The large number of suicides by the farmers in various parts of the country is perhaps the most distressing phenomenon which is observed in India over the decades, and we try to see that it is not that these things are visible homogeneously across the state. The public concern that has reported, and we try to see that the state governments like Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Maharashtra, they have set up an inquiry commission to go into the phenomenon of recording the suicide rates in the respective states. And we try to find out that these studies sometimes they could not generate the ground realities which are being attached, and we try to see that there may be the reasons for that because of the extreme complex phenomenon which are sometimes socio-economic, sometimes cultural or psychological factors, and in that way we try to see that concrete policy making with regard to the farmer suicide was not visible. It has been reported in the 10 years period from 1997 to 2006 that as many as we can see around 166,304 farmers committed suicide in India. If we consider the 12-year period from 1995 to 2006, the figure is close to around 200,000. So, the exact figure would be underestimation, since the major states like Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan and also the few states, smaller states like Pondicherry did not report any farmer suicides for one or the other reasons. So, we can say that sometimes the exact data of the farmer suicide is not very much visible. The number of farm suicide has kept up more steady increase over the period in the country in general, and the year 1998 we show a sharp increase in the number of farmer suicide, and we also try to see that around 16,000 suicides per year over the few years starting from 2001 onwards was been quite visible. So, virtually we try to see that the intensity of the farmer suicide has been on increase, and multiple factors which are associated with this particular phenomenon are going to be an important issue, and we basically try to see that the suicide rate among the farmers were been defined as the number of farm suicide per 100,000 farmers can be calculated on the reliable basis for the year 2001, because the only year for which we have the reliable data on the numbers of farmers in the country, and that is why we try to just calculate with regard to the census of India data. We try to find out that the acute agrarian crisis, and we could find the reasonable reasons for that. Basically, we try to see that the four significant facts which are emerging from the discussions with regard to the farm suicide in the country as a whole are being visible in the form of the issues such as a large number of farmers closer to 17,000 per year commit the suicide today in the country, and a number we believe is unacceptably large. Second is the rate of suicide among the farmer is also likely to be very high in comparison with the rate of general population. And the third issue is the overwhelming proportion, that is nearly 85% of the farm suicides are by the male farmers, and the number of farm suicides by the young farmers accounting for nearly 30% of the total, which is not very small. And finally, we can say that the trend is in both the number of suicides and the rate of suicide are distressing, while the number seems to jump into a higher level in certain years, especially in the year from 1998 to 2002, and we try to see that the exact reasons for that is not very much known. So, virtually we try to see that these are certain conditionalities which are making the things more worse, especially when we try to speak about the issue of the trends which normally we try to agree upon in terms of the frequency of farmer suicide across the nation. We can have certain generalizations which we can pose up in terms of the fact that one important thing which we have to see across the nation is basically when we try to speak about that how the farmer suicides have been seen as the important issue reported during the core green revolution states in India, especially we are trying to speak about the state of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Kerala, Punjab and Maharashtra. They have been comparatively less reported and discussed in the poorer states such as Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, and also in the highly industrialized states such as Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. So, virtually we try to see that the places where the intensity of green revolution has been high, that is the initial state which I have discussed, there the propensity of the farmer suicide has been high, whereas where the industrialization has been more, there the farmer suicide has been less, as been discussed in the state of Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. And where the poorer states are there also we do not find much cases of farmer suicide. So, that is first thing which we can withdraw from the above evidences, and also we try to see second important issue that the majority of the farmers taking their lives are small and medium landholders. The number of large farmers taking their lives is although significant, but they are relatively small. So, the landless laborers have rarely committed suicides. So, we try to see that people who are small and the medium landholders, they are committing suicide, but the landless laborers are not committing suicides. So, the issue of suicide is related with the issue of land. So, higher the issue of land is involved, so we have the higher rate of suicide. So, that is of course one important thing which we can just make out, and especially like the landless laborers are not committing the farmer suicide. So, that is going to be linked with the issue of land. Thirdly, and most importantly, that we try to see that the consensus, that is irrespective of caste and the land holding, is that we try to see that the majority of the farmers were the cotton growers in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. But also we try to see that those who cultivated sugar cane, oil seeds, soya beans and vegetable, rice and wheat growers in Punjab, export oriented plantation owner cultivators of banana, pepper, coffee and vanilla in Kerala, and the betel nut, potato and vegetables and sugar canes grown in Karnataka, they have also shown the amount of farmer suicide. So, these farmers belong to the group of owner cultivators who pursue the commercial cultivation and who are basically seen as the principal constituency of the new farmers movement in India. So, I think somewhere we try to see the linkage which is coming up, especially the new farmers movement, the farmers movements initiatives which have been taking place, and also we try to see that when they are moving from towards the commercial cultivation, that is sometimes aggravating the issue of farmer suicide. So, virtually now coming down to the whole issue of the farmer suicide in the different states in India in general, we try to find out that the top 5 states in terms of the farmer suicide which has been reported in 2001 is basically Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, which accounts for nearly 2/3 of the suicide in the country. And that way we try to see the top 5 states in terms of number of general suicides which we try to see are being visible in Maharashtra, West Bengal, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. And that way we try to see that there are certain similarities with regard to the number of suicides which are happening in fewer states as compared to the state in general. So, we try to see that these instances are to be related with a specific phenomenon whereby the commercial farming are going to be quite high. And similarly, I think the case of Pondicherry, which also has shown the high rate of suicide which were basically being seen in terms of the people who are more into the small number of cultivators who are more into the farm production with regard to the commercial cropping, which was also seen as an important phenomenon with regard to the state of the Pondicherry. We also try to see that Kerala, which comes next to the Pondicherry with a farmer suicide rate of 143, is much larger as compared to the Pondicherry and Goa, but in terms of number of suicide it stands 7th among all the states, partly because the extent of non-farm employment in the states is very high, and hence the number of cultivators relatively is low. So, we can say that the three states, that is Kerala, Pondicherry and Goa, have the higher general suicide rates. Pondicherry in fact has the highest suicide rate in the country, followed by Kerala. So, I think we have the different combinations which are coming up, which try to speak about that how we are going to generalize this particular issue, especially when we try to move towards the other states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Jammu Kashmir and others, where the general suicide rates as well as the farm suicide rate is seen as quite low. So, I think somewhere we try to see that there is certain amount of mismatch which has been visible across the state. The 5 top states which accounts for the higher number of farm suicide are been visible, basically the Karnataka with a farm suicide rate of 36.4 in 2001, coming next to Kerala, and with Chhattisgarh at 33.7 and Maharashtra at 29.9%, not much behind. So, that is how we try to see that the farm suicide rate in Andhra Pradesh, which is 19.2, is also significantly higher than the all India average rate. So, it is worth to note that the average general suicide rate is seen as a comparative picture across the all India rates, and we try to see that the regional pattern of the farmer suicide in India, which has been visible across 21 major states. If you just try to categorize, we find that the number of farm suicides in the state in terms of the farm suicide rate for 2001, and also with regard to the farm suicide as a percent of all suicides in the states, and finally the trend over the 1997 to 2006. The number of farm suicide has been viewed differently, and on the basis of that, if you try to see, we can have the 4 different groups of the states in the country which can be classified based upon the trends of farm suicide. First is the group 1 state. The group 1 states which includes Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. The group 2 stage basically includes Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Goa, Pondicherry, West Bengal and Tripura. Group 3 states which includes the Assam, Gujarat, Haryana and Odisha, and the group 4 state which includes Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab and Jammu Kashmir along with Rajasthan. So, these are the different zones which one can see, and according to these zones we can have the different analysis which are coming up with regard to the farmer suicide, and we basically try to find out that these sort of suicides are sometimes creating the different stories, and we can't have the standardized generalizations which can be seen across these states. Now, let us try to understand that what are the different factors which are basically leading to the farmer suicide, and quickly if we try to see, basically we try to find out that the reasons for the increasing suicide rates among the farmers are, one thing is the failure of the institutional credit for the small and the marginal farmers. Second is the withdrawal of government intervention from safety nets such as the fair price shops and the exclusion of poor and indebted from the food distribution system. Third is the increase of the agricultural input like the seed, fertilizers, pesticides. Fourth is the reduced price of agricultural produce. Fifth is the increased dependency of small farmers on money lenders. Sixth is the cumulative crop loss. So, I think these are certain things which has been discussed with regard to the issue of farmer suicide, and these are the reasons which we can just narrate which can happen. Government of India and the state governments are trying to have various policies, especially the calamity relief funds, the national family benefit schemes, the Raitha Sanjeevani schemes, the pledged loan schemes, Rashtriya Krishi Bhumi Yojana, minimum support price, and also Sankat Harna. All these things are being introduced from the different forums which are meant for basically putting the farmer suicides away, and the insurance schemes which are basically coming in the form of Janatha Rural Pension Accident Insurance, Rajeshwari Mahila Kalyan Insurance, Bhagyashri Female Child Kalyan Yojana, and also we have the insurance for agricultural pump set. Along with that, we have certain other policies like insurance on livestock, and also we try to speak about the Gram Arogya Yojana. So, I think these are certain things which we have to see. The Life Insurance Corporation of India has introduced the Janashri Bima Yojana. So, I think these are certain things which can be seen as a remedial measure for bringing about the changes and to overcome the issue of farmer suicide, but the time has to show us that how we are going to overcome these things. I think wonderful studies have been done which basically tries to locate the understanding of the farmer suicide. Especially I think I have referred in most of the places about Muzaffar Asadi's work on farmer suicide, signs of distress in rural economy, and also the K. Balgopala's contribution in terms of rich peasant and the poor peasants is going to be a wonderful work. And apart from that, we have contribution by R.S. Deshpande, then we have Michael Lipton's contribution, Why Poor Stay Poor, and also Vandana Shiva's contribution on seeds of suicide, the ecological and the human cost of seed monopine and globalization of agriculture is going to be a wonderful work. So, I think A.R. Vasvi's work also is going to be quite significant, especially with regard to the agrarian distress in Bidar. I think these are the works which we try to see, which are going to be crucial for understanding this phenomenon further. So, friends, with these things and with these discussions in mind, let us try to see the dynamics which has been there in the countryside because of the forces of changes which were seen as negatively, and farmer suicide is an outcome of that. So, thank you once again for the patience listening, and we will have the further discussions on these particular issues. Thank you to all of you.